You are watching the Tim Kreitz Adventures channel. Welcome.
Mr. Kreitz, I will hand the podium over to you. Via lets you share your screen and run with it.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you, David, for asking me to do this. As he said, my name's Tim Kreitz, W5GFO. This presentation was originally given to the MARC membership, and it's aimed at new ham radio operators. One of the things we've noticed within the MARC over the last year is that a lot of the guys that are coming in, or who did come in and get their technician, or maybe they tested for technician in general at the same time, and then a few of them have come back and gotten their extras, which is very, very good. But it's just the nature of how the testing goes now that a lot of these guys walk away with their technician or their general or even their extra, and they don't really have any kind of a solid foundation for just the basics of the history of radio. And so that is what I designed this presentation to facilitate, with some learning for those guys. I've been a ham radio operator for 28 years. I bet a lot of you guys have me beat. Some of this may be old hat to you guys, especially considering some of the historical trivia questions you guys were discussing earlier. But David found it interesting, and he asked that I give it to you guys. He thought you might find some value in it too. And I will say this, even after all my years with an interest in radio, I've been a ham radio operator since 1997, and I've also worked professionally in radio and television. I actually learned a few things just researching this presentation, so hopefully, maybe fingers crossed, you guys will too. We often talk about how the adoption of widespread home computing in the 1980s and the 1990s helped usher in the age of World Wide Web and our modern internet-centric communication methods, social media, etc. We understand that it has caused this massive cultural and social shift, the likes of which I think we all would agree have never been seen in the history of mankind. And that's definitely true as far as I'm concerned, but I submit to you, and the overall reaching theme of this presentation is that the proliferation and commercialization of radio in the 1920s into the 1930s had almost as big an impact at the time as the internet age, the dawn of the internet age. And we're going to talk about how some of that happened. Let me just emphasize one last time that this is a general overview of early radio, and that we're going to leave out a bunch of stuff for the sake of keeping this presentation at a reasonable length. The complete history of the discovery and development of radio, as you guys know, is long, it's complicated, and it involves a bunch of people. We're going to concentrate on just a few of them, and it all starts with this guy right here, James Maxwell. James Clerk Maxwell was the first scientist to theorize that electromagnetic waves existed. He essentially proposed that an oscillating electric field coupled with a magnetic field would produce transmittable waves in space. In proposing this theory, he derived a set of equations that changed the world of science. If you're an electrical engineer or an electronics engineer, or if you're even a technician, you're likely very familiar with at least some of these equations. They're referred to modernly as Maxwell's equations, and they explain the laws of electromagnetism as they relate to, radio waves, electromagnetic vector fields, and a whole bunch of other stuff. Maxwell published all this information in 1873, and then he kind of just left it alone. He never tried to prove any of his theories, but a few years later, a guy that you guys have perhaps heard of in one way or another, whose last name was Hertz, decided he wanted to prove Maxwell's theory about radio waves. And here he is. This is Heinrich Hertz. Hertz was also a genius in his own right, as I'm sure most of you will know. Our unit of frequency, cycles per second, was named the Hertz in his honor. Anytime you get a unit of measurement named after you in the science world, you probably had a significant impact on your field, and Hertz certainly did. In order to prove Maxwell's theory, Hertz created the first ever spark gap transmitter. This is basically what it looked like right here. And I included the circuit for it as well, the circuit schematic for it as well. It was a crude machine by today's standards. We were talking earlier in the trivia material about when these spark gap transmitters were outlawed and a little bit about why they were outlawed. We'll get to some of that. But yeah, it was a crude machine by today's standards, but it worked to prove the theory. It was essentially a large induction coil, as you can see there in the schematic, that was powered by a battery, and it charged two great big flat plate capacitors that would discharge to create a pretty large spark in the gap between those two larger spark balls in the foreground image. You can see, oh no, I'm sorry, in the background image, you can see that large spark going between that spark gap on those balls. He took a loop that was made of copper that had two smaller spark balls and a tiny little gap between them, and whenever the transmitter was activated, he would hold the receiving loop close to the emitter, and a tiny little very dim spark could be seen across the spark balls in the receiving loop. And this proved Maxwell's theory in one experiment. And let me just add something to this. If you guys are interested in seeing the Hertz experiment on a much larger scale with a lot more power, Harvard has a YouTube channel that is basically a bunch of lectures and scientific demonstrations. They remake this experiment essentially using a 300 megacycle FM oscillator and a dipole antenna, and then they use a equal-sized piece of copper cylinder and a couple of lights, an incandescent lamp and a fluorescent lamp. And not only do they recreate this experiment, making those lamps glow very, very brightly, but they also use the experiment as an opportunity to show radiation pattern and how radiation pattern works and how nulls work. It's a very short video. It's just maybe 4 or 5 minutes. So it's very, very interesting. And visually, I feel like it's a very good way to teach new hams immediate visual reference for radiation pattern. The thing about proving Maxwell's theory was, for Hertz, he lost interest in it thereafter. It was important to him to prove it, but afterward he saw no viable utilization for these waves. He basically considered them useless. He got bored with the whole mess and he moved on. But several years later, along came this guy right here, who we all have heard of. Marconi is obviously considered the inventor of modern radio, and he grew up a very brilliant, privileged, and troublesome child. His mom, some of you may know, was from the UK, and she was the heiress, or one of the heirs, to the Jameson distilling dynasty. His dad was an Italian aristocrat and owned a lot of land in Italy and had a lot of sway. And so he was a rich kid, to say the least. He was spoiled. His mom spoiled him a lot, and he refused to go to school as a child because he found himself mind-numbingly bored with regular school. So his parents paid for private tutors to come to their estate and educate him. He was one of the early homeschooled kids who broke out and made a big, big name for himself. And he began to thrive pretty immediately in the sciences. And as he got older, he discovered Hertz's work and he became obsessed with it. Unlike Hertz, Marconi immediately recognized that this could be used as a means for communication. He was very much into telegraphy, and he set out to develop what he later referred to as wireless telegraphy, and we call it radio today. At this point, as a side note to the differences between Marconi's electromagnetic work and Tesla's magnetic work, I should make a little point here. We're talking mostly about Marconi and not Tesla in this presentation because although they were rivals and developed similar technologies, they even competed at times on certain things, Marconi's primary interest was in developing communication systems, whereas Tesla's focus was not that. He was working on these big grandiose projects like how to deliver power wirelessly to houses. And we all know that kind of didn't work out for him, didn't pan out too well for him. He was a tragic genius in his own way as well, and he definitely deserves all the appropriate respect. But he was not interested in radio nearly as much as Marconi was. Tesla, it should also be pointed out, got his own unit of measurement as well. When you guys hear me giving the space weather reports and forecasts on, if you listen to the PermNet on Monday nights, or if you listen to the OARS D-Star Net, I will sometimes mention the strength and the direction of the interplanetary magnetic field, which we call the B sub Z. It is given partially in nanoteslas. The Tesla is the name we have given to the unit by which we measure the strength of magnetism. Without going into too much more technical information, Marconi built this giant spark gap transmitter. It was much bigger than Hertz's, and it was much more sophisticated, it was much more sensitive, and he was able to receive signals a little over 2 miles away. He kept building on that, and pretty soon he was going hundreds of miles away. During this era, the modern era of radio was born. I should also mention, by the way, that Marconi was the first one to discover the importance of dipoles when he was building these spark gap transmitters. As he was conducting the longer range experiments, he figured out that if you counterpoise one of the spark balls by grounding it to Earth and then putting a longer radiating element on the other side spark ball, it would be much more effective. It was a very good antenna compared to what he had been working with previously. He didn't know why at the time, but he inadvertently figured out the basic concept of the dipole. And as I'm sure all of you guys know, there are basically two types of antennas, especially that we use in amateur radio. It's either a dipole or a loop. If it's not some type of a loop, it's some type of a dipole. And most antennas that we use are some type of a dipole. So here we are several years down the line, and wireless Morse code using spark gap transmitters is the norm across the world. And as you can imagine, the airwaves are a cacophony. Everybody's using these Marconi radio sets, which in and of itself is a kind of a brilliant thing. You rented a Marconi set. Imagine renting your ham radio transceiver from Yaesu or ICOM or Flex or Kenwood, etc. these days. He could get away with that back then. There are a lot of people are buying Marconi sets. Ships are using them. Coastal regions are using them. And the need for a tuned circuit starts to become very, very important. So several people set out to develop it, including Marconi. Ernst Alexanderson starts to work on one, and as I said, several others do as well. Alexanderson, however, was the first one to get a tuned circuit patented. Now, his worked, and it was actually pretty good, but the main problem with Alexanderson's tuned circuit was that every stage in the radio had to be tuned to that frequency. It wasn't like we have today with Super-Heterodyne and the like, or even regenerative receivers, where all you really have to do is have a local oscillator and you can tune the front end of the radio to tune the circuit. So his patent was important, but it didn't last very long because everybody saw the flaws in it and it was superseded pretty quickly. But it did work, and it worked pretty darn well. Since we're talking about tuned circuits, I need to take a moment here to mention Edwin Howard Armstrong. Even though a majority of his work would become important several years later, it needs to be pointed out that he made great strides in tuned circuits. He also made great strides in the advancement and refinement of AM radio and its hardware, technology, etc., all that stuff. In fact, he invented the regenerative receiver, he invented the Super-Heterodyne receiver, which we are all still using today, and he invented FM. His story is fascinating, but it ends quite sadly with him ending his own life amid a ton of legal problems, patent disputes, financial troubles, the list goes on and on. He was one of those guys who was a scientific genius, but he was a terrible businessman, a lot like Tesla, and an entire presentation actually could be devoted to him. In fact, I'll probably at some point do a presentation just on Armstrong. He was a fascinating guy. Let's talk about how the government starts licensing radio stations. At first without tuned circuits and then later with. But in 1922, 27 stations had been licensed. By April of that year, 88 stations had been licensed. By May of that year, 99 stations, and then by the end of the following year, 556 stations, and it kept on going. The weird thing about this was that They granted all these licenses and everybody's using tuned circuits, but they assigned everybody to 630 meters. The cacophony continued for a while. They did put amateurs eventually down on 400 and something meters. I can't remember exactly what it was. But then they started using ham radio operators and broadcast operators to help divide up the spectrum, figure out what frequencies worked best for what. And then the system and the infrastructure and all the rules governing this stuff started to get better and better. And it moved pretty quickly. Over the period of about a decade, we had a renaissance in this golden age of radio. And here's a perfect example right here. So this is Detroit news station WWJ in 1920. This was a 50-watt AM station. I think Detroit news station WWJ was one of the first to have a regular broadcast day. They would go from sunup to sundown or something like that. I forget the details. But just a few years later, about a decade or so later, here we are in 1935 with WLW. And I'm sure a lot of you guys are very familiar with the great WLW. This is a postcard from WLW in 1935. They're operating at this point in their history at 500,000 watts. So in a decade and a half, we went from 50-watt broadcast stations to 500,000 watts. You can see in the foreground there, they actually had a cooling pond because the amplifier section of the radio station was water cooled. Those tubes were liquid cooled. What they did essentially was they started out as a 500-watt station, went to 5,000, then went to 50,000, and when they wanted to go to 500,000 watts, they used the 50,000 watt transmitter as an exciter for a 500,000 watt amplifier. That is a fantastic story in and of itself. They were so powerful and had so much coverage, they actually had to set up the first viable suppression towers to keep from interfering with Canadian broadcast stations. So here we are. This is where we start to see the practical importance of what's happening. We now have news, weather, sports, music, shows and dramas, emergency broadcasts. All of this stuff happens pretty quickly. The proliferation of radio and the commercialization and utilization of it in the 20s and 30s affected rural people the most, more especially farmers and those type of people. Keep in mind, in the 1920s and 1930s, America was more rural than it was urban. That's not the case today. Today, more people live in cities and towns and in population centers than they do in rural areas. So we've had a flip-flop in the last 100 years. But imagine going from getting a newspaper once a month, or maybe if you were lucky, once a week, as a farmer or as a rural person, to be able to hear the news updated every single day on your radio set. This was a tremendous cultural change. News started to spread much, much, much faster. Also, this applies to weather. Imagine being a farmer who before radio had to plan his crop year with a farmer's almanac. And that's the way they used to do it. That's one of the reasons the Farmer's Almanac was so important to farmers back in those days. Well, now we have up-to-date weather forecasts every single day. And I read something somewhere, this is another little trivial stat that I've lost, that once radio started to proliferate through farms and farm country in America, the efficiency of crop yield was exponentially greater than it had been before, just because farmers could make better decisions based on what was happening and what would happen short term with regard to the weather. So that was a big, big thing. Sports also and music also became hugely popular. It turned the radio into the first form of electronic in-home entertainment. You could now listen to the ball game, which was a big thing. America's pastime. Baseball was hugely, hugely popular in the day, and so was boxing. Being able to listen to a boxing match on the radio and during the 1930s especially was hugely popular. And of course, something that we're all involved in to one degree or another as amateurs, we now have emergency broadcast, and emergency information can be spread very, very quickly. And by the 1950s, we had the civil defense frequencies, and I think you're all pretty familiar with that. I don't need to go into too much detail there. This photo right here is also something that grabs the culture of the moment during the golden age of radio. This is the radio shop. And the radio shop was very important for a lot of reasons. Number one, if you were a farmer or lived in a rural area and you did not have electricity, you had to go to this place about once a week or once every couple of weeks to recharge your battery packs. And while you were there, you would get anything you need. You might need to have one of your radios worked on. You might need some tubes. You also would go there to hang around with people. It became sort of a coffee shop type of a vibe. You would talk about what you had listened to, the news of the day, and also all of the schedules for the coming weeks and months were available at the radio shop. If you didn't have electricity in your house and you were running your radio sets completely on battery, you needed to know when to turn your radio on and when to leave it off based on what you thought was important to your household. And so these radio schedules were something that you went to the radio shop to get to. It was like a TV guide for the day, but for radio. And you see back behind that guy, behind the register, there are all kinds of posters for not only equipment, but for upcoming radio shows. This is a group of people listening to the radio and playing a trivia game. You would go to the radio shop and get these magazines, these little tabloid magazines, and they would have photographs and puzzles and questions and diagrams that all related to the upcoming trivia broadcasts. And these people are trying to beat each other at trivia sitting in the house listening to the radio. And of course, we don't need to hire a band to come up and play at our ball or at our dance at the house. We don't even need the piano player. We're going to listen to the phonograph, and we're going to listen to the radio, and we're going to dance to the songs. All right, before I conclude here, I just want to mention a few other people. We talked a little bit about Tesla, but if you're interested in this kind of thing, you might want to look up Bose. Oliver Lodge also was hugely important. I could do another half hour or so. I could do an hour or more on Oliver Lodge. That's someone to look up and study about his contributions, especially in the early days. And regarding ham radio itself, you guys, if you're not familiar with W6AM Don Wallace, there are some really good videos of him on YouTube as well. And one is an extended, about an hour and a half interview with him. He's probably the first guy who ever got famous for being a ham radio operator. We've known a lot of guys who have been very famous celebrities, and they were also ham radio operators. You know, Joe Walsh, Barry Goldwater, etc., etc., Chet Atkins, the list goes on and on. But Don Wallace became famous for being an operator. And this was back in the days when the lines between broadcast radio and amateur radio were very much blurred. He got his first license before there were really even any laws governing amateur radio. And back then, in the early days, you could actually come up with your own call sign. They squashed that pretty quickly. But he started out as 6 a.m., but he was so famous that by the time the FCC started enforcing A, K, AKW, and N, depending on your location, they wanted him to still have 6 a.m., so he got W6AM. Check out Don Wallace. Fascinating, brilliant radio engineer, brilliant radio man. As a teenager, he was telegraph operator operating a 5,000-watt spark gap transmitter on President Wilson's ship. So that's how early he was in the game. Any questions I might be able to answer, or any further discussion, anything you guys would like to add, you're more than welcome to do it at this time. All right.
Any comments, any questions, any additions?
All right. I guess I did a good job. Either that or everybody fell asleep.
Job, Tim. Thank you very much. I don't see anybody snoring, so.
Okay, good deal.
We did good.
All right.
I appreciate it, sir.
Oh, it was my pleasure. Anytime.